Welcome back to PEF Explorations, where I will be talking again to Alex Ariotti about her excavations at the fortress site of Tawabin in Jordan. And today we're going to be looking in more detail about some specific aspects of her finds at the fortress site, in particular those very impressive fortifications and forts. So, Alex, can you tell me a little bit about your recent excavations and what they've revealed at Tawabin?
Sure. Well, Felicity, as you know, we dug 11 probes around the site, the largest being up at the fort and the citadel, with smaller probes dug inside forts B and C, inside 3 of the stone circles, and lastly across sections of Tawabin's massive fortification wall. For a start, although we didn't discover any finds associated with Tawabin's fortification, we discovered that this wall is in fact built as a 4 to 4.5 meter wide casemate, meaning 2 parallel walls of large boulders separated by a 2 meter wide trench, and with some watchtower emplacements along sections of the wall. Inside the compound, excavation within 3 of the stone circles has produced some evidence to show that rather than forming the basis of soldiers' tents, they may represent seasonal, temporary human and/or animal shelters, perhaps built and used or reused by Bedouin at least 130 years ago when they were first documented. Some of these circles are also clearly burials. Now, we know from past ethnographic studies that nomadic groups regularly traveled through this area on seasonal migration with their goat and sheep in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In light of this fact, the stones at surface level likely constitute the bases of small tent encampments, and with entrances all facing east to provide protection from the winds. Furthermore, a preliminary study of the botanical material originating from one of the stone circles by archaeobotanists Annette Hansen and Fritz Heinrich identified some charcoal as well as some lentil and date seeds that suggest that people were preparing and or eating food in or nearby this particular structure. It's my hope that some radiocarbon dating of this material will provide us with a firm date for when the circles were used. Elsewhere, excavations within forts B and C didn't yield any pottery or other finds that could help date these buildings. And so we can only consider the type of masonry and evidence which is comparable to the site's fortification in terms of the large boulder stones and dressed ashlar blocks used in their construction. This type of masonry, together with the presence of some Bronze and Iron Age surface pottery identified across this part of the site, initially allowed us to speculate that forts B and C, as well as Tawabin's fortification, may be earlier in date than the fort and the citadel, for example, with origins that predate the 2nd century BC. However, my more recent research has found that they could be equally attributed to the late Hellenistic, early Roman period, which is a theory I'd like to resolve despite the absence of indisputable or direct archaeological evidence.
That sounds really fascinating. Alex, can you tell us a little bit more about the fort itself on the citadel?
Well, firstly, this part of the site, the citadel, has been really impacted by looting and other activities over the long term. And so it's hard to imagine or visualize what the fort looked like, its design, its layout. What we do know is that the fort was built with stone and mud bricks, and that some of its interior walls were decorated by colored frescoes, as evidenced by a piece of colored wall plaster we found during excavation. I will say too that no other decorative architectural elements such as column drums or bases or even mosaics were found that would otherwise suggest this building served any other function other than as a defended watchpost. The fort, or more broadly speaking, the citadel, was protected on its south side by 5 artificial ditches called fosses, about 5 meters deep, that enhance its overall defensibility, and with the possibility too of some type of ramparts, as attested by the many worked and semi-worked rectilinear boulders that have tumbled into each fosse. As a defended fort, the main prerequisite for its location on the citadel would have been its strategic vantage point and, importantly, the supply and storage of water. So the small reservoir and the adjacent larger cistern uncovered by excavations were designed to store and collect large volumes of water used for drinking, washing, and bathing. For instance, the reservoir would have accumulated rainwater runoff from its roof during the winter months, and when required, to also store water along with the cistern that was presumably transported by pack animals up from the dam below the citadel or from the Wadi Hassa spring. Together with the supply of water, we have a fair idea about what the fort's inhabitants were eating. As well as fish and meat, an ongoing study by Annette and Fritz of the carbonized plant remains from the reservoir has so far shown that they were consuming cereals such as hulled barley, hard wheat, and bread wheat, as well as fruits like fig, olive, and date, and some pulses. Along with the architecture and archaeobotanical evidence, the coins and pottery from the fort provide us with a clearer picture of its chronology. An examination of the coins by our specialist Peter Edwell found that they may be dated with reasonable certainty to the 4th and 5th centuries AD. However, the stratified pottery so far dated attest to an earlier occupation, indicating that the fort was built and inhabited from the late 2nd century BC onwards. Most of the pottery dates from the late 2nd BC to the 2nd century AD, and with a considerable quantity of it being what we call Nabataean. The pottery represents common domestic household items used for cooking, eating, drinking, storage, and transport, such as plates, bowls, cups, and jugs, and so forth. Other types in our assemblage were considered to be more valuable or high-end, such as the red glossy terrasigillata bowls, alongside the Nabataean painted fineware shallow plates or bowls, which have characteristically thin walls and painted geometrical and floral decoration, which we found in abundance. It's important to bear in mind that some of these Nabataean types, such as the painted fineware plates and the plainware bowls, continue to be produced into the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. We also have a few well-known types like the imported late Roman fineware, dating from the 4th to 6th centuries, which is evidence, together with the coins, of an occupation lasting into the late Roman and early Byzantine period. So based on this evidence combined, we now know that the fort on the citadel was inhabited from the late 2nd century BC onwards and served as a lookout post built for defensive and observation purposes. Because of the predominance of Nabataean pottery across this part of the site, we can say that the fort was occupied by the Nabataeans as a strategically positioned and easily defended fort designed to monitor Nabataean territory, commodities, and to any potential threats beyond, as well as movements along arteries like the Wadi Hassa and the Wadi Araba, the latter being a major trade and travel route. The coins and pottery also suggest that the site was then utilized and reoccupied by the Romans as part of a local defense and surveillance system up to the 6th century AD. I should say at this point that my continuing study of the pottery and other finds will help to fine-tune or clarify the sequence of occupation at the fort to resolve the questions of whether the Nabataeans built the structure or simply later occupied it. What is pretty clear is that Tawabin at one time formed an integral link in the chain or group of fortifications, a few of which have now been surveyed and or excavated along and above the Wadi Hassa, the Wadi Araba, and the Dead Sea, together with numerous smaller east-west running valleys and ravines which in antiquity facilitated routes of travel and trade. These fortifications not only form part of the local Nabataean defense system, but in many instances a subsequent Roman one called the Limes Arabicus.
Tawabin is just one in a whole chain of fortifications that protect all these trade routes and protect the security, presumably, of the goods and people who are traveling along those routes. Alex, can you tell me a bit about the Nabataeans and why, in your view, they occupied the fort at Tawabin? And then also, why did the Romans take it over after the Nabataeans ceased to be an independent nation?
To most of us, Felicity, the Nabataeans are synonymous with the great city of Petra in Jordan. They were originally a nomadic tribe from northern Arabia who began transporting, trading frankincense and myrrh from Arabia to the Mediterranean in the 4th century BC. And gradually they began to control all of the trade routes around the region. By the end of the 4th century, they had established their capital at Petra, which over time grew in wealth from its position alongside several trade routes, and with Nabatean territory incrementally expanding around the region. So much so that by the 1st century BC, the Nabatean Empire comprised much of present-day Jordan, the Negev and Sinai, at one time extending to Gaza on the coast in southern Palestine, as well as parts of Syria, even though its borders were often changing and sometimes indistinct. The region immediately south of the Dead Sea was part of the Nabatean kingdom, with Zawara as a regional capital. And this locality also marked a border, or was close to the border, between Nabatea and neighboring Hasmonean ruled Judea. Now, this area would have required monitoring and defense, especially when Hasmonean King Alexander Jannaeus captured Nabatean territory around the Dead Sea, including Zawara, at around 100 BC, clearly for its commercial assets. This episode was followed by sporadic wars between the Nabataeans and Judea throughout the 1st century BC, no doubt necessitating the establishment of Nabatean defense posts such as forts and watchtowers along and above the Wadi Araba and the Dead Sea prior to the Roman annexation of the Nabataean kingdom in 106 AD, when the Nabataeans lost their political independence. Many of these Nabataean fortifications were taken over by the Roman army, which shared the same tactical and strategic security issues.
Why was this region so important to the Nabataeans and then subsequently the Romans?
Well, the Roman limes was established after Rome's annexation of Nabatea in 106, but consolidated by Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries AD. And this was based in part on the preceding Nabataean defense system, which was designed to police nomadic tribes, to provide security in the more densely populated regions of Nabatea, and to control, maintain, and protect the lucrative trade routes. From the 4th century AD onwards, the wider region was then under Roman control, and it was divided into various Roman provinces, with the Wadi Hassa marking the border between Palestina Tertia to the south and east, in which Tawabin and Zawara were located, and Arabia to the north. The fortifications of the Limes Arabicus, of which Tawabin may have been a part in a region such as the southern Gauls, were perhaps designed not so much to protect or guard these provincial borders against external enemies, because they were all Roman provinces, but to provide security and to police the region's population, its settlements, its travel and trade routes, its arable lands, water sources, roads, and lastly, the many valuable commercial and agricultural assets which this whole district offered in antiquity. Tawabin overlooks Zawara, which in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD was considered to be a renowned Nabataean city, as well as an agriculturally rich oasis and imperial estate where dates and balsam were cultivated and exported, even by the last Nabataean king, Rabal II, who owned date plantations in Zawara in 99 AD. In addition to dates and balsams, the latter used in perfumes and medicines, the Dead Sea and the wider Wadi Araba region produced salt, asphalt or bitumen, sulfur and copper, all of which were exploited first by the Nabataeans and then by the Romans. For example, we know that the Nabataeans were engaged in the bitumen trade of the Dead Sea, which was a commodity sold to the Egyptians for mummification practices. The whole region south of Zawara in the Wadi Araba, particularly at Wadi Fanan, was also mined intensively for copper, first by the Nabataeans, who began using this material in building and for domestic purposes in the 1st century, and then by the Romans between the 2nd and 5th centuries AD. At the same time, Zawara was an administrative center, and it was also the seat of a Christian bishop between the 4th and 6th centuries AD. And therefore, this important city and its surroundings would have needed security and policing. Historical sources inform us that the city hosted a large cavalry unit of native mounted archers from the 3rd to early 5th centuries AD, which some scholars have directly associated with Tawabin on the basis of some tombstones belonging to military officers recovered from the Safi area. So in this sense, the fort at Tawabin, along with numerous other fortifications in the region, were designed to not only provide security, but to defend, observe, and control the commercial and agricultural assets, which were valuable not only to the local population, but to the imperial authorities. So to conclude, Felicity, Tawabin was an easily defended fortified site, a fortress, crucially positioned above Zawara, the Wadi Hasra and the Wadi Araba, that was accessed by a road, or more aptly put, a camel trail called the Abash Ascent, leading southeastwards from the site up to at least 3 other defended watch posts in the highlands above, which I've also visited. As a Nabataean defensive post, the site was most likely utilized by the Roman army, presumably because of its location, its size, and its massive fortification, that itself likely dates to the late Hellenistic early Roman period or even earlier. These findings are based on the studies so far undertaken of the material recovered by excavation. There's still a lot more work to do, of course, and it's my hope that this investigation of the Ghor El Safi project continues to further shed light on the once lost fortress of Tawabin. On a final note, I'd like to say too that the continuity of the PEF's involvement from the late 19th century, when the site was first documented, until today is a testament to their long-standing interest and commitment to rediscovering the fortunes of this impressive site. And my thanks again to the PEF for their support.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your investigation of this linchpin of Nabataean and Roman administrative infrastructure, as it were, in terms of how they functioned over such wide areas and controlled the trade, controlled the people of this incredibly important strategic region. I think the PEF has done very well for its money and its investment in your research, and we very much look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you.